Nobody paid much attention to the woman who mopped the floors. That was just how things were at Hargrove Memorial Hospital. Doctors moved fast down the hallways. Nurses had charts in their hands and patients to check on. The administrators stayed mostly in their offices, behind glass doors and stacked paperwork. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise and movement, a quiet woman in a pale green uniform pushed a mop cart from one end of the third floor to the other, every single night, and almost no one looked up. Her name was Ruth. She was 53 years old, with gray coming in at her temples and hands, that had known hard work her whole life. She did not have a degree on the wall or a title that made people stand up straighter. She was a hospital custodian, and she had been doing this job for 11 years. She came in at 10 at night and left before the morning shift arrived. Most days, the only people who even knew she existed were the few who passed her in the hallway and gave a small nod. Not really seeing her, just acknowledging that something was there. And that was fine by Ruth. She was not the kind of woman who needed a lot of noise around her. She had grown up in a quiet house with a mother who believed that real work didn't need an audience. You just did it. You did it well, and you went home. Ruth had carried that lesson into every job she had ever held, and she carried it here, too, down every hallway, into every room that needed cleaning, past every closed door behind which someone was trying to sleep. The third floor of Hargrove was the oncology wing. That is the floor where cancer patients stay. Ruth had known that from her first week on the job. Back then, she had not thought much about what it meant. A floor was a floor. Tiles needed mopping. Bins needed emptying. Bathrooms needed scrubbing. She had come to work with her head down and her schedule in her pocket, and she had done what was asked of her. But the third floor had a way of teaching you things, if you stayed long enough. The first thing Ruth really noticed, was the silence at night. Not the peaceful kind of silence, something heavier than that. It was the silence of people who were awake at 2 a.m. because they were afraid, and they had nobody left to call at that hour. She would hear it as she passed the rooms. A light on under the door, a television turned down too low to actually watch. Sometimes just a person sitting up in bed, staring at a wall. She started stopping. Not for long, just a minute here, a minute there. She would tap lightly on an open door and ask if everything was all right. Most of the time people said yes. They were fine, just couldn't sleep. Ruth would nod, say something ordinary like she hoped the rest of the night was easier, and move on. But sometimes, and this was the part she never quite planned, the person would say something back. A real something? Not the polite answer, but the true one. There was an older man, sometime in her 3rd year on the job, who stopped her one night and asked if she had a minute. He had been on the floor for 3 weeks. His family had driven in from another state and stayed the first week, but they had lives to get back to, jobs, children of their own. He understood that. He truly did. He just wasn't sleeping well, he said, and he found himself talking at night to whoever was around. Ruth pulled a chair from the hallway and sat outside his door, and for about 40 minutes, he talked. About his late wife, about his garden back home, the tomatoes he had been growing for 30 years, the way the soil smelled after rain. Ruth listened. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. When he finally wound down, he looked a little lighter. He thanked her. She told him the tomatoes sounded wonderful. She meant Italiano. She went back to her cart and finished the rest of the floor. This was not in her job description. Not even close. If her supervisor had seen her sitting in a hallway chair having a conversation at 2 a.m. instead of cleaning, it would have been a difficult conversation, Ruth Kanayodad. She was not naive about how the hospital worked. There was a very clear idea of who was supposed to care for patients, and it was the people with the lanyards and the scrubs and the clipboards, not the woman with the mop. But Ruth had also learned something in 11 years on that floor, that nobody in the staff meetings or the patients at committees seemed to have figured out yet, which was that the nights were long and lonely, and a lot of the people on the 3rd floor were facing something so enormous they could barely put words to it. And sometimes what they needed more than medicine or procedure was simply another human being who was not in a hurry. Someone who could sit still, someone who would listen without looking at a watch. She became, over time, a kind of unofficial landmark on the floor. Patients who had been there a while started to recognize the sound of her cart. A few of them would leave their doors slightly open, which Ruth came to understand as a signal. Not always. Sometimes, it just meant they forgot to close it. But sometimes, it meant if you have a minute. And when Ruth had a minute, she used it. She never made promises she could not keep. She never pretended things would be fine when she didn't know if they would be. She didn't have the training for that kind of conversation. And she knew her limits. If something a patient said worried her, if someone seemed to be in real distress, she went straight to the nurse's station. She was very clear on that line, but she also understood that not every hard feeling at 2 in the morning is a medical emergency. Sometimes it is just grief, and grief needs a witness. The hospital around her kept moving the way hospitals do. New equipment arrived. Staff rotated. A new wing was announced. A committee was formed to look at how patients experienced their care. A long table of doctors and administrators with a presentation and a graph. Ruth was not in that meeting. Her name was not in the agenda. She wouldn't have expected it to be. She came to work the following Tuesday. Same as always. Parked her cart at the end of the hall, started at room 301, and worked her way down, quiet and steady, the way she had done for 11 years. Outside room 3018, she noticed the light was on. She tapped on the open door. The man inside was in his late 70s. He had been on the floor for just over 2 weeks. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just a small releasing, the way a person's shoulders drop when they finally hear a familiar sound. Can't sleep either, Ruth? Husk it, he shook his head. She left her cart by the wall and pulled the chair a little closer to the door. And somewhere in the quiet middle of a Tuesday night, while the rest of the hospital ran on its routines, a woman that nobody had chosen for anything sat down and listened. Down the corridor, a young journalist who had stayed late that night to finish an interview was walking back to the elevator. He turned a corner and stopped. He stood there for a long moment. Who'st watchin'? He wasn't sure why he didn't keep walking. Something about the scene, the stillness of it, the simplicity held him in place. A woman in a pale green uniform sitting in a hallway chair. An old man talking softly. A mop cart leaning against a wall. He stood there for nearly 10 minutes. Then he quietly turned around and took the stairs. He didn't sleep well that night either. But it wasn't sadness keeping him awake. It was the feeling that he had just seen something important, something that didn't have a name yet, and he was trying to figure out what to do with it. He went back the next day. Not to talk to Ruth. He wasn't even sure he would run into her. But because he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. He was a young journalist working on a small anniversary publication for the hospital. His job was to write about the people who made the place run, the department heads. The surgeons who had been there 30 years. The donors who had funded the new East Wing. Those were the stories he had been assigned. Those were the people on the list. But he kept seeing that hallway. The pale green uniform. The old man's voice, low and steady, filling a corridor that was supposed to be quiet. The mop cart, leaning against the wall like it had all the time in the world. He started asking a question. Just one simple question. And he asked it to every patient or family member who would give him 5 minutes. The question was this. Was there a moment during your time here when you felt like you were not completely alone? He expected people to name the doctors, maybe a nurse who had gone above and beyond. He had a notebook ready for those names. What he got instead surprised him. The first person he asked, a woman in her 60s who had just finished a long treatment, thought about it for a moment, and then said there was a lady who came by at night sometimes. Heavyset, she said, gray hair. Always had her cart with her. She sat with me one night when I couldn't sleep, the woman said. I don't even remember what we talked about, but I remember I felt better after. He wrote that down and moved on, assuming it was a one-off, the kind of small kindness that happens in hospitals sometimes, without any pattern to it. But then the second person said something similar, and the third. By the time he had spoken to 7 different patients, people on different floors, people who had been at the hospital in different years, people who had never crossed paths with each other, he had the same woman described to him 7 times, not by name, mostly. A few knew it. Ruth, they said, when they remembered. Most just described what she looked like and what she had done. She stayed. She listened. She didn't rush off. She made me feel like I was a person, and not just a room number. He found her on a Tuesday evening. She was in the hallway outside room 318, working her way through the corridor the way she always did. slow and he introduced himself and explained what he was working on. Ruth looked at him the way a person looks at something they are not quite sure what to do with. She was polite. She said she appreciated him coming to talk to her. Then she said she didn't think she had done anything worth writing about. She told him she just talked to people sometimes. She told him the mop still needed to go to the 4th floor. He wrote the piece anyway. It was short, 400 words, maybe a little more. It ran on page 6 of the hospital's internal newsletter, the kind of publication that sits in waiting rooms and gets glanced at between appointments. He kept it simple. He didn't call Ruth a hero. He didn't use words like angel or miracle. He just described what she did, quoted to patients who had agreed to be named, and said plainly, "People remember her." He titled it, "The Third Shift." For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened. The newsletter sat in its usual pile near the elevator bank. People picked it up, flipped through it, set it down. The hospital kept moving in the way hospitals always do, loud and fast and relentless. And the small story on page 6 seemed like it was going to disappear into the noise the way most things do. Then a hospice nurse on the 2nd floor read it during her break. She didn't say anything to anyone. She just went to the supply room, found a photocopier, made several copies, and taped one to the break room wall. She slipped the others under the doors of a few colleagues she thought should see it. Word moved quietly after that, the way quiet things sometimes do, not in a rush, not loudly, but steadily. A department head forwarded the newsletter to the chief of medicine with no message attached, just the article. A family who had lost their mother 6 months earlier and who had written a bitter letter to the hospital, bored about feeling abandoned in her final days. That family somehow came across the piece. They sat with it for a while. Then they wrote a letter back. They said they had not known the woman's name until they read the article, but they recognized her immediately from the description. She had sat with her mother on the last night. They just wanted someone at the hospital to know that it had mattered, that they had not forgotten. The letter was passed up the chain until it reached the chief of medicine, a man named Dr. Ost, who had worked at Hargrove for 30 years, and who was, by all accounts, a serious and formal person. He was not the type to make grand gestures. He did not organize ceremonies or give speeches about the human side of medicine, though he believed in it privately. He was the kind of man who showed up, did the work, and expected others to do the same. On a Thursday morning, he walked down to the 3rd floor. He found Ruth restocking a supply closet near the nurses' station. He introduced himself, which she did not need to do. She knew who he was. He told her he had been hearing things about her. He told her he thought she had been doing something the rest of them had forgotten to do. He said, "Thank you." Ruth told him the supply closet was running low on mop heads again. He put in the order before he got back to his office. The hospital did not give Ruth a raise after that. No plaque went up in the hallway. She was not invited to join the patient satisfaction committee, which continued holding its meetings at the long table with a presentation and the graph. Life at Hargrove went on more or less exactly as it had before. New patients came in. Others went home or didn't. The 3rd floor stayed busy, and Ruth kept showing up at 10 o'clock, parking her cart at the end of the hall, and working her way from room 301 to the end of the corridor. Same as she always had. Years. Pass. The hospital went through a restructuring. Budgets tightened. The anniversary publication was cut entirely. The journalist moved on to a larger paper in another city. Dr. Osti retired after 33 years and gave a short speech at a small dinner that most of the senior staff attended. The patient satisfaction report was published, praised briefly at a board meeting, and shelved. Ruth retired at 68. There was a small gathering in the break room on her last day. 12 people, give or take. Someone had brought a sheet cake with her name written in blue frosting. It was a Tuesday, which felt right somehow. A charge nurse who had worked the 3rd floor for most of the time Ruth had been there stood up and said she had something to read. She had been collecting things quietly, over the years, notes and cards and letters that patients and families had sent to the hospital. Many of them addressed simply to the night cleaning woman on the 3rd floor, or to the lady with the gray hair in the cart, because they didn't always know her name. The charge nurse read them one by one. There were 14 of them. They came from different years, different people, different circumstances. Some were long and detailed. Some were just a few lines. One was written on the back of a get well card, but they all described the same thing. The middle of the night. A light on in a dark hallway. A woman who stopped. A woman who stayed. Ruth sat in a plastic chair next to the sheet cake and listened to all 14. She did not cry, though some of the others in the room did. When the charge nurse finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said the cake was good, and she hoped whoever was taking over her route remembered that the supply closet on the 3rd floor always ran low on mop heads by Thursday. People laughed. The room felt a little lighter. Later, walking to her car for the last time, Ruth thought about the old man from room 388. She thought about his tomatoes, the garden back home, the way he had described the smell of the soil after rain. She had thought about him many times over the years. She hoped things had gone well for him. She didn't know. She had never needed to know. That was not the point. The point was the staying. The sitting down, the listening without looking at a watch. It had never been complicated. It had just been a choice, made quietly, night after night, in a hallway that most people walked through without looking up. She was the last person they would have chosen. She was the only one they remembered.